The morning sun streamed through the airport windows as passengers lined up at Gate 32 for Flight 1867 to Chicago. Among them stood Tanya, a business executive in her early 40s, tapping away at her phone with perfectly manicured nails. Dark circles under her eyes betrayed her exhaustion from back-to-back meetings all week. Her designer blouse was still crisp despite the early hour, and she checked her watch repeatedly, clearly annoyed by the slight boarding delay. A few feet away, Zoe adjusted her backpack strap while chatting with her mom on the phone. "Yes, I'll call when I land. Love you too," she said with a smile. A bright-eyed college student returning home for spring break, Zoe had spent the semester working on her engineering degree while interning at a local tech firm. Her natural curly hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail, and she wore a university sweatshirt with comfortable jeans. "Now boarding Group A," came the announcement, and both women moved forward in the line. Tanya pushed ahead slightly, muttering about needing to get settled quickly for an important call. The narrow airplane aisle was crowded as always. Passengers bumped against each other while trying to stow their luggage and find their assigned seats. Tanya quickly claimed her window seat in row 14, placing her designer handbag on the empty middle seat beside her, hoping no one would sit there. She pulled out her laptop and began reviewing documents. Zoe checked her boarding pass. 14C, the aisle seat in the same row. She approached with a friendly smile. "Excuse me, I think I'm sitting here," she said politely. Tanya barely looked up, moving her bag to her lap with a sigh. She continued typing as Zoe settled in, placing her backpack under the seat in front of her. An older gentleman took the middle seat, nodding politely to both women. The plane filled quickly. Flight attendants moved through the cabin, checking seatbelts and overhead compartments. The captain's voice crackled over the speakers, announcing a flight time of 3 hours and 7 minutes, with expectations of mild turbulence about halfway through. Zoe pulled out a dog-eared paperback, a science fiction novel she'd been trying to finish all semester. She became absorbed in the story as the plane taxied and eventually took off, the engines roaring as they climbed into the clear blue sky. About 30 minutes into the flight, the seatbelt sign dinged off. The flight attendants began preparing the beverage service, rolling carts down the narrow aisles. Tanya continued working, occasionally sighing loudly when the passenger in front adjusted their seat. "Would you like something to drink?" asked a friendly flight attendant when the cart reached their row. The older gentleman in the middle requested a ginger ale, while Tanya ordered black coffee without looking up from her screen. Zoe smiled. "Just water, please." The flight attendant poured their drinks and moved on. The cabin was filled with the gentle hum of the engines and quiet conversations. Zoe placed her water bottle in the seat pocket and returned to her book, completely engrossed in the story. When Zoe reached to retrieve her water bottle, the plane hit a small pocket of turbulence. Her elbow accidentally bumped against Tanya's arm, causing her to press a key on her laptop unintentionally. "Watch it," Tanya snapped, far louder than necessary. Several nearby passengers turned to look. "I'm so sorry," Zoe apologized immediately. "The plane just shook a bit." Tanya glared at her, then muttered something under her breath as she aggressively fixed whatever had happened on her screen. The older gentleman between them shifted uncomfortably. "Really, I didn't mean to." Zoe began again, but Tanya cut her off. "Just be more careful," she said coldly. "Some of us are trying to work." Zoe nodded and returned to her book, though her enjoyment was now diminished. 10 minutes passed in uncomfortable silence. Tanya sipped her coffee while typing furiously, occasionally shooting irritated glances at Zoe. The tension might have dissipated if things had ended there. But when Tanya reached for her coffee cup again, something changed in her expression. A hardening, a deliberate calculation. As she lifted the cup, her hand moved not toward her mouth but outward, and then tipped. The dark liquid poured directly onto Zoe's lap, splashing across her jeans and dripping onto her backpack below. The coffee wasn't scalding hot by this point, but it was warm enough to make Zoe gasp and jump up as much as the confines of the airplane seat would allow. "Oh my goodness," exclaimed the woman across the aisle. Zoe stood in shock, coffee dripping from her clothes. What? Why did you do that? She asked, her voice trembling slightly. It was an accident, Tanya said flatly, though her expression suggested otherwise. Then, just loud enough for those nearby to hear, she added, maybe if you people knew how to behave in public, things like this wouldn't happen. The cabin seemed to freeze. The casual racism of the comment hung in the air, impossible to ignore. The older gentleman beside them stared in disbelief. That was completely uncalled for, said a woman from the row behind, her voice firm. A young man across the aisle offered Zoe some napkins from his tray table. Here, use these. Zoe accepted them with shaking hands, dabbing at her soaked jeans while fighting back tears. She refused to cry in front of this woman. Instead, she took several deep breaths and said, I don't know what I did to make you dislike me so much, but that was deliberate and we both know it. Tanya didn't meet her eyes, suddenly becoming very interested in her phone. You're overreacting. It was just coffee. A murmur of disapproval spread through the nearby rows. An older woman 3 rows up stood to get a better look at what was happening. The atmosphere in the cabin had shifted from the usual travel tedium to something charged and uncomfortable. Is everything okay here? A flight attendant named Ray approached, having noticed the commotion while collecting trash further up the aisle. His eyes quickly assessed the situation: the coffee-stained jeans, the tension between the passengers, the concerned faces of those watching. She spilled coffee all over me on purpose, Zoe explained, her voice steady despite the situation. And then she made a racist comment. Tanya scoffed. It was an accident, and now she's making ridiculous accusations. Ray's expression remained professional, but his eyes narrowed slightly. He'd been flying this route for 12 years. He'd seen it all. The good, the bad, and the ugly side of people trapped together in a metal tube hurling through the sky. And he could tell when someone wasn't being truthful. Ma'am, he said to Zoe, let's get you cleaned up first. Please come with me to the galley, and we'll find something to help with those stains. As Zoe stepped into the aisle, Ray turned to Tanya. I'll be back to speak with you in a moment. Please remain in your seat. His tone was polite but left no room for argument. The incident had lasted less than 2 minutes, but as Zoe followed Ray toward the back of the plane, she could feel dozens of eyes on her. Some sympathetic, some curious, all aware that something significant had just happened. What had started as a routine flight had suddenly become anything but ordinary. Ray led Zoe to the rear galley of the plane, away from the curious eyes of other passengers. The small space was cramped but offered a moment of privacy amid the chaos. Zoe's jeans were soaked with coffee, a dark stain spreading across her thighs. Let me get you some club soda and more napkins, Ray said, his voice calm and reassuring. He moved efficiently in the narrow space, grabbing supplies from various compartments. I'm really sorry this happened to you. Zoe took a deep breath, trying to steady herself. Thank you. I don't understand why she would do that. Ray handed her a stack of napkins and a bottle of club soda. Unfortunately, we see all kinds of behavior up here at 30,000 feet. Some people think the normal rules don't apply once they leave the ground. He showed her how to dab, not rub, at the stain. What exactly did she say to you? As Zoe quietly repeated the woman's words, another flight attendant named Priya approached. Her experienced eyes took in the situation immediately. That's completely unacceptable, Priya said firmly. We have a zero-tolerance policy for discriminatory behavior on our flights. She exchanged a meaningful look with Ray. I'll check our manifest. We need to know exactly who we're dealing with. Back in row 14, the atmosphere was tense. The older gentleman sitting in the middle seat, a retired high school principal named Mr. Chen, had shifted as far away from Tanya as the narrow airplane seat would allow. He'd witnessed everything and was visibly uncomfortable. Across the aisle, a woman in her 30s named Diane had unbuckled her seatbelt and leaned over. What you did was completely out of line, she said to Tanya, keeping her voice low but firm. Tanya barely glanced up from her phone. Mind your own business, it was an accident. An accident followed by a racist comment? Diane challenged. We all heard what you said. A few rows ahead, a man turned around. Everything okay back there? He asked, concerned. Mr. Chen nodded politely. The flight attendants are handling it. Tanya huffed dramatically. Everyone's making such a big deal over nothing. I barely bumped her with the cup. That's not what happened, said a college student sitting behind her, who had captured part of the incident on his phone while recording the clouds through the window. You deliberately poured it on her. I saw you. Murmurs rippled through the nearby rows as more passengers became aware of what had transpired. An older woman offered her package of wet wipes to pass back to Zoe. A businessman frowned disapprovingly at Tanya while texting rapidly on his phone. I've been flying this route every month for 3 years, said a frequent flyer across the aisle. Never seen anything like this, completely uncalled for. Tanya's face flushed, but she doubled down. Everyone's so sensitive these days. It was just coffee. It wasn't just coffee, Mr. Chen finally spoke up, his voice quiet but carrying the authority of someone who had managed schoolyard conflicts for decades. It was what you said afterward. There's no place for that kind of language or behavior, not on this plane, not anywhere. Tanya stared straight ahead, jaw clenched, refusing to engage further. The tension in the cabin was palpable. Some passengers whispered among themselves, while others pretended to be absorbed in books or screens but were clearly listening to every word. Meanwhile, in the rear galley, Zoe was doing her best to clean her jeans with club soda. The coffee had cooled, but the stain was spreading despite her efforts. We have a spare pair of airline pajama bottoms from first class, Priya offered. They're not stylish, but they're dry. Zoe managed a small smile. That would be amazing. Thank you. Ray returned from checking with his supervisor. We've notified the captain about the situation. He takes these matters very seriously. He paused, choosing his words carefully. Would you feel comfortable returning to your seat? We can arrange for someone to switch with you if you'd prefer. Zoe straightened her shoulders. I'm not going to let her push me out of my assigned seat. I didn't do anything wrong. You absolutely didn't, Ray agreed. But your comfort and safety are our priority. I appreciate that, Zoe said. But I think I should go back. Running away would just, I don't know, it would feel like letting her win somehow. Priya nodded with understanding. You've got more courage than many passengers I've seen. I'll walk with you. As they prepared to return to the main cabin, another flight attendant appeared with a pair of navy blue pajama bottoms. Zoe gratefully took them and ducked into the tiny airplane lavatory to change. Her jeans were ruined, but at least she wouldn't have to sit in wet clothes for the remainder of the flight. When she emerged, Ray was waiting with a plastic bag for her stained jeans and a complimentary snack box. A little something to make the rest of your flight more bearable, he explained with a kind smile. What's going to happen to her? Zoe asked quietly. We're addressing it, Ray assured her. The captain has authorized us to take appropriate measures. Nobody gets to behave that way on our aircraft. As they walked back through the cabin, Zoe could feel eyes on her, but they weren't unkind. An elderly woman squeezed her hand as she passed. A young man gave her a thumbs up. A mother with a sleeping child on her lap mouthed, "You okay?" And Zoe nodded in response. When they reached row 14, they found Tanya had moved to the window seat, leaving the aisle seat open for Zoe. Mr. Chen gave Zoe an encouraging nod as she sat down. Flight attendants, please prepare for service in the Yao. Main cabin, came the announcement over the PA system, but Ray didn't move. Ms. Henderson, he addressed Tanya formally, having checked the passenger manifest. Would you please come with me to the front galley? The lead flight attendant would like to speak with you. Tanya looked up, her expression a mixture of defiance and sudden uncertainty. I'm in the middle of important work. Can't this wait until we land? No, ma'am, it cannot, Ray said firmly. Please bring your personal belongings with you. This is ridiculous, Tanya muttered, but she gathered her laptop and handbag, avoiding eye contact with the other passengers as she followed Ray toward the front of the plane. As soon as they were out of earshot, the atmosphere in the cabin shifted. A flight attendant offered Zoe a fresh cup of water. Mr. Chen introduced himself properly and assured her that he'd witnessed everything and would be happy to provide a statement if needed. Diane from across the aisle leaned over. That was handled really well. You okay, honey? Zoe nodded, feeling a wave of relief wash over her. I think so. I just wasn't expecting anything like this to happen today. Nobody ever does, said the college student behind her, who introduced himself as Alex. But that flight attendant is about to show her who's boss for sure. The passengers around her formed an impromptu support network, each offering small kindnesses. A spare pair of earbuds when Zoe mentioned hers were in her backpack and might have gotten wet. A magazine to read, words of encouragement. As the beverage service continued, Zoe caught a glimpse of Ray speaking intensely with Tanya at the front of the plane. The lead flight attendant had joined them, her expression serious and professional. Whatever was being said, Tanya no longer looked defiant. For the first time since the incident began, she looked worried. The front galley of the airplane was a cramped space, barely big enough for the 3 people now standing in it. Ray stood with his back to the cockpit door, while Tanya faced the lead flight attendant, Naomi. Through the thin partition, they could hear the regular sounds of the cabin. The hum of the engines, occasional coughs, the clinking of ice in plastic cups. Ms. Henderson, Naomi began, her voice level but firm. She was in her 50s, with streaks of gray in her dark hair, and the confident bearing of someone who had handled every type of passenger situation imaginable. I understand there was an incident in row 14. Tanya shifted her weight, clutching her designer handbag like a shield. It's being blown completely out of proportion. I accidentally spilled some coffee and now everyone's acting like I committed a crime. Ray raised an eyebrow but remained silent, allowing his supervisor to lead the conversation. We have multiple passengers who witnessed what happened, Naomi said. They've confirmed it wasn't an accident, but even more concerning are the comments you made afterward. I don't know what you're talking about, Tanya said, her eyes darting toward the exit as if calculating an escape route that didn't exist at 35,000 feet. Naomi consulted a small notepad where she'd jotted down details. According to several witnesses, after deliberately spilling coffee on the young woman, you said, and I quote, "Maybe if you people knew how to behave in public, things like this wouldn't happen." Tanya's cheeks flushed. I didn't mean it like that. How exactly did you mean it? Naomi asked, her tone making it clear there was no acceptable answer. Tanya fell silent. Ms. Henderson, I've been flying for 26 years, Naomi continued. I've seen passengers at their best and their worst. I understand that travel can be stressful, but what happened back there crossed a line. Ray nodded in agreement. Our airline has a clear code of conduct that all passengers agree to when purchasing a ticket. That includes treating fellow passengers and crew with respect, regardless of race, gender, religion, or any other factor. I know my rights, Tanya said defensively. You can't just... Actually, we can, Naomi interrupted calmly. The captain has full authority over this aircraft, and based on the reports I've received, he's authorized me to take appropriate action. Meanwhile, back in the main cabin, the regular rhythm of the flight had somewhat resumed. Flight attendants continued the beverage service, passengers watched movies or dozed, but there was still an undercurrent of awareness around row 14. Zoe sat quietly in her aisle seat, the airline pajama bottoms a strange but comfortable replacement for her coffee-soaked jeans. Mr. Chen had kindly swapped seats with her so she wouldn't have to sit directly next to Tanya when she returned. If she returned. Do you think they'll make her move? Asked Alex from the row behind, leaning forward. Slightly. They might, replied Diane from across the aisle. I once saw a passenger relocated for much less on a flight to Denver. A flight attendant named Luis paused by their row while collecting trash. Everything okay here? Can I get anyone a refill? I'm fine, thank you, Zoe said. Then lowering her voice, do you know what's happening up front? Luis gave a discreet smile. Naomi's handling it. She's been with the airline longer than any of us. Trust me, she knows exactly what she's doing. In the front galley, the conversation had taken a more serious turn. These are your options, Ms. Henderson, Naomi explained. Option 1. You return to your seat, but in a different location away from the passenger you harassed. You will not approach or speak to her for the remainder of the flight. Upon landing, you will be met by airline representatives for further discussion about this incident. Tanya's expression tightened. And option 2? There is no option 2. That involves you remaining on this flight if you cannot agree to option 1, Naomi said simply. The captain has the authority to divert this aircraft to the nearest suitable airport if a passenger poses a threat to the safety or comfort of others. Divert? For spilled coffee? Tanya scoffed, but her voice had lost its earlier confidence. For deliberate harassment with racial undertones, Ray corrected, which violates federal aviation regulations as well as our airline's policies. Tanya looked between the two flight attendants, seeming to realize for the first time the seriousness of her situation. I can move seats. That's fine. Naomi nodded. We'll relocate you to 27F at the back of the aircraft. You'll be served by different flight attendants for the remainder of the journey. I also need to inform you that several passengers have indicated they've recorded portions of the incident. While we can't control what they do with those recordings, I suggest you keep that in mind. The color drained from Tanya's face. In an age where moments of public misbehavior could go viral within hours, the potential consequences suddenly seemed to dawn on her. Before we proceed, there's one more thing, Naomi added. An apology. You want me to apologize to you? Tanya asked, confusion crossing her face. No, Ray said. To the passenger you harassed. She deserves that much. Tanya hesitated, her pride visibly battling with self-preservation. Fine, she finally said. I can do that. Good, Naomi replied. But I need to be clear. It must be sincere. No qualifications, no excuses. A genuine acknowledgement of wrongdoing and a proper apology. Back in row 14, the passengers had formed a protective bubble around Zoe. A woman with a young daughter had shared homemade cookies from a small container. Mr. Chen had offered Zoe his airline magazine when he noticed her book had also been splashed with coffee. Alex had shown her funny travel photos on his phone to lighten the mood. Look at us, Diane said with a warm smile. Strangers an hour ago, and now we're like a little family. A family that stands up for each other, added a businessman who had been quietly observing from the row ahead. Their conversation halted when Ray appeared at the end of the aisle. Miss Chen, may I speak with you for a moment? He asked Zoe. She nodded and followed him to a small open area near the emergency exit. The passenger who harassed you is being relocated to the back of the aircraft, Ray explained in a low voice. But before that happens, she has something she would like to say to you. You are under no obligation to listen if you don't want to. Zoe took a deep breath. No, it's okay, I'll hear her out. Ray studied her face. Are you sure? Your well-being is our priority here. I'm sure, Zoe said with quiet dignity. I think it's important. For both of us. Ray nodded and led her back toward the front galley where Naomi and Tanya were waiting. As they passed through the cabin, passengers watched with curious eyes. The entire plane seemed to be holding its breath, waiting to see what would happen next. In the confined space of the galley, Zoe stood tall despite being shorter than both Tanya and the flight attendants. There was an awkward moment of silence, broken only by the steady background noise of the aircraft. Naomi gave Tanya an expectant look. Tanya cleared her throat. Her earlier arrogance notably diminished. She looked at Zoe directly for perhaps the first time since boarding the plane. I owe you an apology, she began, her voice unsteady. I owe you an apology, Tanya began, her voice unsteady. The cramped airplane galley suddenly felt even smaller as the four people stood facing each other. The steady hum of the engines provided a constant background to the tense moment. Tanya glanced at Naomi, who gave her an encouraging but firm nod to continue. What I did was wrong, Tanya admitted, her eyes briefly meeting Zoe's before darting away. The coffee, it wasn't an accident. I was frustrated and took it out on you, which was completely inappropriate. Zoe stood quietly, her face composed but guarded. The airline pajama bottoms she now wore were a visible reminder of what had transpired. And what I said afterward, Tanya continued, visibly struggling. Those words they were hurtful and prejudiced. There's no excuse for that kind of language or behavior. She took a deep breath. I'm truly sorry for how I treated you. The apology hung in the air between them. Ray and Naomi remained silent, allowing the moment to unfold naturally. Zoe considered the woman before her. Tanya looked different now, smaller somehow, without the shield of arrogance she'd worn earlier. The carefully applied makeup couldn't hide the tight lines of stress around her eyes. Thank you for apologizing, Zoe finally said, her voice soft but steady. I appreciate that you recognize what happened. Tanya nodded, looking slightly relieved but still uncomfortable. I just want to say one thing, Zoe added. When something like this happens, it's not just about that moment. It stays with you. It makes you question yourself and your place in the world, even when you know you've done nothing wrong. Tanya's gaze dropped to the floor. I understand, she murmured, though it wasn't clear if she truly did. I hope you do, Zoe said simply, because that's how change happens, when we really understand the impact of our actions on others. Naomi stepped forward. Thank you both. Ms. Henderson, Ray will now escort you to your new seat in row 27. Please gather any remaining belongings from your original seat without engaging with the other passengers. As Ray led Tanya back into the main cabin, the atmosphere shifted subtly. Passengers who had been pretending not to watch now openly followed her progress down the aisle. No one spoke, but the collective awareness was palpable. Tanya kept her eyes forward as she quickly collected her laptop case from her original seat. Mr. Chen stood to let her access the window seat where she'd left a few items, his expression neutral but watchful. Once she had gathered everything, Ray guided her toward the rear of the aircraft. As they passed row by row, Tanya could feel the weight of dozens of eyes upon her. It was a long walk to row 27, made longer by the silent judgment of strangers who had witnessed her behavior. When they reached the back row, Ray gestured to the window seat. This will be your seat for the remainder of the flight, Ms. Henderson. Luis will be handling service for this section. Please remain in this area until we reach our destination. Tanya nodded and slipped into the seat, immediately opening her laptop as if to create a barrier between herself and the rest of the world. Ray returned to the front where Naomi was speaking quietly with Zoe. You handled that with remarkable grace, Naomi told her. Many passengers would have responded very differently. Zoe managed a small smile. My grandmother always said that the true test of character is how you behave when things are difficult, not when they're easy. Your grandmother sounds like a wise woman, Naomi replied warmly. Now let's get you back to your seat. The captain would like to speak with you briefly when he has a moment. As Zoe returned to row 14, she was greeted with subtle nods and smiles from the passengers around her. Mr. Chen had switched to the window seat, leaving the more accessible aisle seat for her. All sorted? Diane asked from across the aisle. I think so, Zoe replied, settling back into her seat. You know, said Alex from behind them, I fly a lot for school competitions, and I've never seen airline staff handle something like that so professionally. Mr. Chen nodded in agreement. It was impressive, firm but fair. The captain's voice came over the intercom, announcing that they were beginning their initial descent into Chicago and would be landing in approximately 30 minutes. Flight attendants began moving through the cabin, collecting final items of trash and ensuring tray tables were secured. About 10 minutes later, the cockpit door opened and the captain emerged. He was a man in his early 50s with salt and pepper hair and the confident posture of someone used to being in command. After a brief conversation with Naomi, he made his way to row 14. Ms. Chen, he said, crouching slightly in the aisle to be at eye level with Zoe. His voice was low enough that only those in the immediate vicinity could hear. I'm Captain Rivera. I wanted to personally apologize for what you experienced on my aircraft today. Thank you, Captain, Zoe said, surprised by the gesture. Your crew has been wonderful. They're the best in the business, he replied with a hint of pride. But I want you to know that as the captain of this flight, the safety and dignity of every passenger is my responsibility. What happened to you today is not representative of our airline or the experience we want for our customers. He handed her a business card. My office has been notified of the incident. When we land, a customer service representative will meet you at the gate to take your statement and discuss next steps. Your case has been assigned a tracking number, which is written on the back of that card. Zoe took the card, touched by the thoroughness of the response. We take these matters very seriously, Captain Rivera continued. Not just because it's policy, but because it's right. Everyone deserves to travel without fear or harassment. I appreciate that, Zoe said sincerely. The captain gave her a respectful nod before returning to the cockpit. As he walked away, Diane reached across the aisle to briefly squeeze Zoe's hand in a gesture of solidarity. See, she whispered, that's leadership. The seatbelt sign illuminated as the plane began its final approach into Chicago. Outside the windows, the vast expanse of Lake Michigan came into view, its surface glittering in the afternoon sun. The skyline of the city appeared on the horizon, a familiar sight to some passengers and an exciting new vista for others. As the aircraft descended through scattered clouds, the cabin was filled with the usual sounds of arrival, the whir of the landing gear deploying, the subtle shifts in engine noise, the rustle of passengers gathering their belongings and preparing for landing. In row 14, Zoe gazed out at the approaching city, feeling a strange mix of emotions. The day had certainly not gone as planned. What should have been a routine flight had turned into something entirely unexpected. A moment of confrontation, yes, but also of connection. She glanced around at the people who had become her impromptu supporters. Mr. Chen with his quiet dignity, Diane with her forthright kindness, Alex with his youthful indignation on her behalf. Strangers who had chosen to stand with her rather than look away. At the back of the plane, Tanya sat alone, staring out at the same view but likely seeing it very differently. The choices she had made today would follow her off this aircraft, just as surely as her carry-on luggage. The plane banked slightly, aligning with the runway. The flight was almost over, but the story wasn't. What happened next would depend on choices yet to be made, by the airline, by Tanya, and by Zoe herself. The wheels of the aircraft touched down on Chicago's runway with a gentle bump, followed by the familiar roar of the engine's reversing thrust. Passengers instinctively leaned forward slightly, as if their collective will could help the plane slow down faster. The flight attendants' voices came over the intercom, welcoming everyone to Chicago, where the local time was 2:17 p.m. and the temperature a pleasant 68 degrees. Please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened until the captain has turned off the seatbelt sign, Ray announced as the plane taxied toward the terminal. In row 14, Zoe felt a strange mix of relief and tension. The flight was over, but what would happen next? She glanced at the business card Captain Rivera had given her, running her thumb over the raised logo of the airline. First time in Chicago? Mr. Chen asked, noticing her thoughtful expression. No, I'm actually heading home, Zoe replied. I've been away at college. My mom's waiting to pick me up. Ah, a homecoming, he said with a warm smile. That's always special. From across the aisle, Diane chimed in. Do you think they'll really do something about what happened? In my experience, these things often get brushed under the rug once everyone's off the plane. Alex leaned forward from the row behind. Not this time. Too many witnesses. Plus, I got most of it on video when I was recording the clouds for my photography class. Zoe turned to look at him, surprised. You recorded it? Not intentionally at first, Alex explained. But when I realized what was happening, I kept filming. I've already had 3 people ask me to send them the video. The seatbelt sign dinged off and the cabin immediately filled with the sounds of passengers standing, opening overhead bins and gathering belongings. But unlike the usual rush to exit, there was a sense of anticipation in the air, as if everyone was waiting to see how this unusual journey would conclude. Naomi appeared at the front of the cabin. Ladies and gentlemen, we have a special request from our ground staff. The passengers in rows 14 through 17 and row 27 are asked to remain on board briefly after we reach the gate. All other passengers may deplane as usual. We apologize for any inconvenience and thank you for your cooperation." Murmurs rippled through the cabin as people speculated about what this meant. Ray moved through the aisle, pausing briefly beside Zoe. "Customer service representatives will meet us at the gate," he explained quietly. "They'd like to speak with you and the other witnesses while everything is still fresh in everyone's minds." Zoe nodded, suddenly feeling the weight of the entire incident pressing down on her. What had begun as a simple flight home had transformed into something much more complicated. The aircraft came to a stop at the gate, and the familiar chime signaled that it was safe to use cell phones again. All around them, passengers powered on their devices, the cabin filling with notification sounds and ringtones. As the majority of passengers filed off the plane, those in the designated rows remained seated, creating small islands of people in the otherwise emptying cabin. At the very back, Tanya sat alone, her face illuminated by the screen of her phone as she typed frantically. Once the main exodus had concluded, a woman in a crisp airline uniform entered the aircraft. She spoke briefly with Naomi before approaching. "Row 14, Ms. Chen," she said, extending her hand. "I'm Valerie Thompson, Customer Advocacy Manager. Thank you for your patience today. If you'll come with me, we've set up a private area where we can talk." As Zoe gathered her backpack, Mr. Chen stood up too. "I was sitting right here when it happened," he said. "I'd like to provide my account as well, if that's helpful." "Of course, sir," Valerie replied. "We're speaking with all witnesses." Diane and Alex also volunteered their perspectives, and one by one, the passengers who had witnessed the incident deplaned and were escorted to a quiet area of the terminal normally reserved for VIP customers. The small conference room had comfortable chairs, refreshments, and large windows overlooking the tarmac. Valerie took detailed notes as each person recounted what they had seen and heard. Alex played his video recording, which clearly captured both the coffee spilling incident and Tanya's subsequent comment. "This is exactly the kind of documentation that helps us take appropriate action," Valerie explained. "Without it, these situations can become one person's word against another's." Meanwhile, in another part of the terminal, Tanya sat across from two other airline representatives. The conversation was private, but through the glass walls of the office, her body language told its own story. Defensive at first, then gradually, deflating as the reality of her situation became clear. Back in the conference room, Valerie turned to Zoe after finishing with the other witnesses. "I want to personally apologize for what you experienced today. It falls far below the standards we set for the treatment of our passengers." "The crew handled it really well," Zoe said, giving credit where it was due. "Especially Ray and Naomi. They're two of our best," Valerie agreed. "But we still need to address the harm that was done." She slid a folder across the table. "Inside you'll find several things: a formal letter of apology from the airline, a voucher for replacement of your damaged clothing, and a complimentary round-trip ticket to anywhere we fly within the continental United States." Zoe opened the folder, surprised by the thoroughness of the response. "This is more than I expected." "There's something else," Valerie continued. "The passenger who harassed you has been placed on our no-fly list for the next 6 months, pending completion of our customer conduct review process. She may be allowed to fly with us again afterward, but this incident will remain on her record." "I don't want to ruin someone's life over this," Zoe said quietly. "You're not," Valerie assured her. "Actions have consequences, and in this case, the consequence is temporary and proportional. It's also an opportunity for growth and change." As they concluded their conversation, Valerie walked Zoe to the main terminal where her mother was waiting. After warm goodbyes and handshakes, Zoe finally embraced her mom, the familiar scent of her perfume, a welcome reminder of home. "Everything okay, sweetie?" her mother asked, noticing the airline pajama bottoms and the folder in Zoe's hand. "You look like you've had quite a journey." "It's a long story," Zoe replied, linking her arm through her mother's as they walked toward the exit, "but I think it ended the right way." 3 months later, Zoe was back at college, deep into her spring semester engineering projects. Her roommate entered their dorm room waving an envelope. "This came for you in the department mail." Zoe opened it curiously. Inside was a handwritten note on expensive stationery. "I've thought a lot about what happened on that flight." It read, "The airline required me to take an inclusivity workshop as part of the reinstatement process, but I wanted to do more than just check a box. I've been volunteering with a community organization that builds bridges between different cultural groups in my city. It's changing how I see the world. I can't undo what I did, but I wanted you to know that it led to real change for me. With sincere gratitude for your grace that day, Tanya Henderson." Zoe read the note twice, then carefully placed it in her desk drawer. She wasn't sure how she felt about it yet, but there was something powerful in knowing that a moment of confrontation had led to genuine reflection and growth. That same week, the airline announced a new comprehensive training program for all staff on handling incidents of discrimination or harassment on flights. In the press release, they didn't mention specific incidents, but they did quote a veteran flight attendant named Naomi about the importance of addressing these situations promptly and professionally. "Every passenger deserves dignity and respect in our care," she said. "Sometimes that means making difficult decisions and having uncomfortable conversations. But that's how we make the skies friendly for everyone." The story of what happened on Flight 1867 never went viral or made national headlines. But it did change things, for Tanya, for the airline, and for Zoe, who decided to write her senior engineering thesis on designing more inclusive spaces for public transportation. Small moments, it turned out, could create ripples far beyond what anyone might expect. And sometimes at 35,000 feet, those ripples became waves of change.